Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The pesky French have once again shown themselves unworthy and unreliable allies. Their second-rate navy has taken 90 migrants from French waters over to our waters, ordering one of our ferries to divert in the process. So why are we paying them nearly £500 million of your money? Also, that something may surprise you this evening. As it emerges that the Duchess of Sussex will not be attending the coronation, I will be defending her against a certain former editor of The Sun. You won't want to miss it. And the Scottish nationalists are taking the government to court after its legislation was blocked in a constitutional first, and it happened to coincide with the defining issue of a generation, the trans debate. I'll be debating it shortly with the veteran LGBT campaigner, Peter Tatchell. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be hearing from our esteemed panel, the pugnacious former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and perhaps the equally pugnacious Jerry Hayes, who was allegedly assaulted last time he was on the show. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of this programme. Email us, mailmog@gbnews.uk. But now it's time for the all-important headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening to you. Our top story tonight, the US President is currently being welcomed in Dundalk in the Republic of Ireland after touring Carlingford Castle in County Louth today as part of his 3-day visit there. Crowds of well-wishers braved the rainy weather to watch his motorcade arrive. Mr Biden's grandfather, James Finnegan, was born in the county. And earlier, President Biden spoke to Ulster University. That was when he was in Northern Ireland, where he highlighted the significance of the Good Friday Agreement. Also, incidentally, praising the Windsor Framework, saying it addressed the practical realities of Brexit.
Sometimes, especially when the distance of history, we forget how hard-earned, how astounding that peace was at the moment. It shifted the political gravity in our world. There were no guarantees that the deal on paper would hold. No guarantees that it would be able to deliver the progress we celebrate today. It took long, hard years of work to get to this place. It took a people willing to come together in good faith and to risk boldly for the future.
Biden speaking at Ulster University earlier on today. Well, meanwhile, police have confirmed that 4 pipe bombs discovered at a cemetery in Londonderry on Tuesday were viable devices. They were found just a day after Republican commemoration and sparked a major security operation. A senior officer says he believes the explosives are attributable to the new IRA. Police believe the bombs would have been used to attack police. Now, the Scottish Government is planning to launch a legal challenge against Westminster's decision to veto new gender recognition reforms. Scotland's Social Justice Secretary says the bill was passed by an overwhelming majority in Holyrood with support from all parties. Shirley-Ann Somerville warning that the British government's use of Section 35 risked setting a dangerous constitutional precedent over what she said were devolved matters. Rishi Sunak, though, has hit back, saying the move means that he has concerns now over its impact on women's safety. The BMA has formally asked the government today to enter talks facilitated by the conciliation service ACAS to help end the junior doctors' pay dispute. It comes after thousands of junior doctors in England walked out for the second of 4 days of industrial action this week. Downing Street have refused to negotiate unless the British Medical Association abandons its demands for a 35% pay rise. And just lastly, emergency services are searching for a woman who we believe has been swept out to sea in Brighton as Storm Noa continues to sweep across the UK. Sussex police are carrying out a search and rescue operation as heavy rain and 70-mile-an-hour gusts continue. Meanwhile, hundreds of properties have been left without power tonight and several rail services have been reporting delays or cancellations. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on the TuneIn app. You're with GB News, Britain's news channel. Back now to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Sir Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the longest serving as it happens, he did over 21 years, which I was hoping for from Boris. But leaving that to one side, Sir Robert Walpole famously said, "I do not dislike the French from the vulgar antipathy between neighbouring nations, but for their insolent and unfounded air of superiority." And that seems to me to be the quotation of the day, if not the week, if not of the month, because what has just happened is so extraordinary. Migrant boats in the Channel, in French waters, were escorted from French waters, where they were the responsibility of President Macron, into UK waters, where we picked them up and where no doubt they will now be claiming asylum, and a British ferry had to be diverted to make way for the French. Now, we are paying £500 million to the French to help them police the border and stop migrants leaving and trying to get to this country illegally. What value for money are we getting? They seem to be taking our cash but delivering migrants rather than delivering the goods. And there is a real problem because actually it's quite fun to mob up the French, isn't it, to talk about Crécy and Agincourt and Trafalgar and Waterloo and the various intervening wars, and talk about General Wolfe and his great successes, the heights of Quebec. But actually, we need to get on with our closest ally, our closest neighbour, with a neighbour of fundamental importance to us, a big economy, a country with which we've had a relationship going back since the Dark Ages, since it was a country, really, and we, of course, became a country earlier than they did. But Macron seems not to be delivering the goods. He seems to have a policy that is deliberately unhelpful to the British because the French Navy reports directly to the President. He is the head of their armed forces. He's their head of state. He is the real power within the land. France may not have a monarchy, but it has very much the direction of its state that Louis XIV would have been familiar with, a power centred in one man. And this one man not only doesn't deliver on the small votes, but also he's sucking up to China and saying that Europe should try and detach itself from the United States. Well, you will remember from yesterday that I think we shouldn't be too sentimental about the special relationship, but we have to recognise that the US is on our side in favour of freedom, of the rule of law, and China is not. China is a much bigger threat to us than the United States will ever be. And if the free world doesn't coalesce, if it doesn't work together through NATO and recognise where its interest lies, that is fundamentally risky for all of this. Who would be helping the Ukrainians if it were just left to the EU? Well, nobody. Very little would ever have happened. It required the sheer power, the depth, the resources of the US. And this is where what Macron's been saying has been so dangerous, because he was saying that we should not take America's view on Taiwan. And this gives the impression that we don't care about the fundamentals of the rule of law. Taiwan is an interest of the United Kingdom, it is an interest of the United States, it is an interest of the free world. And China's bullying of Taiwan is something that we as a free country should always be opposed to. And when our closest and most important neighbour is sucking up to the communist Chinese, we know something is wrong, and we see it with the failure of the French to help us with the small boats, actually delivering small boats to us. It is a real and serious problem. And of course I want to know what you think at home. Please get in touch. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.uk. Well, I've got a brilliant panel today, best possible panel to discuss this. The former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and Jerry Hayes, who was injured the last time he was
I was. Thanks to your Latin, I was saved.
I hope you've recovered.
Yes, I have.
Isn't it extraordinary that the French are now providing an escort service to small boats to get them into UK?
To be honest, I think it's more cock-up than conspiracy. It was a foggy day in the Channel. There was a lot of danger. Both sides had to make a decision on where they would go. But going back to the main point, why are the French behaving like this? I once said to Douglas Hurd in the TQ, which you'll know very well, look, why have the French done this? And he just said, Jerry, because they're French. Because they are very different. They're 22 miles away, but they're totally different. His economy is in tatters at the moment. His party's in a bit of a mess. His country's in a bit of a mess. They're doing something perfectly sensible for once. They're saying pensions should actually go up. Not pensions, but the age should go up. So why does he go to China? Purely a stunt. Doesn't realise what he's doing. He did all this with Russia as well. Nothing more than that. Showmanship. But this morning in the Channel, I don't think this was particularly deliberate.
Kelvin, do you think it was deliberate?
Yeah, I think it's part of a policy that once the boat has actually hit the water, even if it's literally a metre,
that's a yard and a bit.
I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. I think the decision then is they're on their way. And the idea, I mean, after it was a frigate that told the ferry to get out the way. And so, I mean, I admire the ferry for understanding who had the power in this matter. But it is ridiculous. So that was 90, that was Harold then. But when you talk about Macron is obviously flawed in some respect. He has now no power, therefore, because of the way that the voting went against him. And therefore, what he's doing is he's doing what all prime ministers or presidents do when they have no power at home. They seek to have alleged influence abroad. Right, so why don't we look at how he has acted in Ukraine? He spent hours and hours on the phone to Putin saying, I think there is a possibility of a deal, there is. And then he finds out he's being taken for a bloody fool, right? After all, he was speaking to him prior to the invasion and coming away and saying, look, you don't need to worry, there isn't going to be any invasion. The truth about the matter is I suspect he is vainglorious and he sees us as an easy home win because he says to himself, why should we be lumbered with all these migrants? Why don't we just hurry them onto another country who we don't like anyway?
But there are basically two global powers, aren't there? There's the US and there's China. And it must be in our interest, and indeed French interest, to be on the side of the US and of freedom rather than on the side of communist China.
Well, of course we are. And that's why we support
Taiwan. But Macron isn't.
Well, Macron is Macron. He's French. They have a different way of looking at things.
But doesn't this matter? Isn't this a real opportunity for China if it can divide the West in this way. Because Macron, he may be an irritant to us, he may send the small boats in our direction, but actually in the EU councils, the French still carry a good deal of clout.
Well, of course they do. And look what's happening in various parts of Africa, French influences. Fact of the matter is, Macron is a desperate, desperate man. He's not thinking EU, because the EU should be involved in this. We should be all on the same side of democracy, of the rule of law, which China totally, totally ignores. He's been a damn fool.
And Taiwan is the most remarkable country. I've been lucky enough to go there in my business career. That very few natural resources, but a hard-working, well-educated people who have made themselves rich while standing up to one of the biggest bullies in the world. We should definitely be supporting them, shouldn't we?
101%. And the one thing about Biden is, much as I dislike the manner in which he has treated Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, therefore he's treating us badly, right, is that he does accept that Taiwan is the flashpoint which is going to lead to a collision. I say this, though, if China did decide to take a full tilt at Taiwan, and he says, the leader says, this is going to be ours within a generation. In Hong Kong, we have taken 330,000 migrants coming here. Good. They're all capitalists. They all believe in free speech. They all believe in things. Taiwan should all come here. It would we should give them Wales. We should give them Wales. And we should give them Wales. And if there's and we should let them go to Northern Ireland. They would transform these economies. We should get used to the idea that that for whatever reason the Chinese cleverness, commercial cleverness, is something which belongs to Asia, and we need to get back in our country. We're going broke without their thought process.
I just want to know, and perhaps you can tell us, and perhaps you shouldn't tell us, perhaps you don't know, but you're closer to government than Kelvin and I are at the moment. At the moment, I mean, he was in the cabinet, which means absolutely nothing nowadays. But it doesn't really matter. What would we do? What would the West do if there was a successful invasion of Taiwan? What would we do?
Well, we have to try and make sure that doesn't happen.
No, that's politicians' answer. What would we actually do?
That's right, but that's why helping Ukraine was so fundamentally important. It's why the French approach is so dangerous, because when Crimea was invaded in 2014, the French and the Germans did absolutely nothing and did a deal with Putin. That made it clear to him that he could invade. The strength of what Boris Johnson led a year ago to help the Ukrainians has made it clear to China that there will be consequences.
Back to Taiwan. What would we do?
That's why Ukraine's been so important, because of the message.
Do you think the Chinese understand that message?
Oh, definitely.
That's why they're on manoeuvres at the moment.
Absolutely, definitely, and why they backed down over closing airspace over Taiwan or Taiwan territory, which they closed, and then they said, oh, well, we're only closing it for 27 minutes later on in the day. So they do realise the risks of doing anything in Taiwan.
Tomorrow morning, Taiwan is invaded. Death, destruction. What do we in the West actually do?
Well, actually, it's deterrence that saves the day. But this comes back nicely to where we started on migrants, because what we need is deterrence to make them think they can't get here. But if they're brought here by the French with an escort, then we're in trouble, aren't we?
See, one of our issues is that there is no political solution to this. France aren't interested. It helps them to get rid of them, and it causes us aggravation. Fantastic. Win-win for them. Right? We don't seem capable of doing anything politically against the French. We don't seem to have any leverage. I go back to my original idea, and the one that causes always a row about it. Why don't we take some of those 50 SAS guys who are currently helping in Ukraine, and why don't we stick them in Belgium and the French coast and simply knock off the smugglers?
Well, because we'd immediately get into trouble with the European Court of Human Rights in a way that would be quite serious, and the European Court of Human Rights is already meaning that we've got to take all these migrants anyway. So, actually, even with your solution, we've got to sort out the European Court first.
That's not exactly what the European Court of Human Rights, as well you know. They haven't said that as well.
And it would disagree with us taking people out in Belgium. That's sadly true.
Yes, but
remember
what's the
death on the rock?
Yes.
But I want Calvin to come back on this, because it's his policy, and I don't think it can work.
Yeah, no, but my issue about it is that we are prepared to, I presume there is something really shocking happening to Russians, thanks to the SAS, right?
Yeah.
Very secretly. Now it's been denied by the Ministry of Defence. We know it's true.
Yes.
So and by the way, I don't blame them for denying it.
No.
Right. So why don't we simply say we accept that is the situation? Why don't we go into Belgium and France and do it?
Well,
because we could do it, because
they're sovereign nations, for a start.
It has to be said, Kelvin, going into Belgium has sometimes caused considerable problems. I refer back to 1914. But as I said, my panel would be brilliant, and we are going to hear more from them later on. As always, don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, Chinese espionage has been taking place on our soil, and it's caused quite the conundrum in government. And we'll also be hearing from someone who's been at the forefront of the fight against the looming threat of the Chinese communists. After that, I'll be joined by a man who once tried to arrest Robert Mugabe.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my common sense crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. And you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Damon says, the EU always takes other people's money and delivers very little in return. That is one reason why we left. But John says France is not a prison camp for the UK. The French have no obligation to stop people leaving. Defending the UK's borders is the UK government's responsibility. But that's why I think Ian is right, because he says if the French are escorting migrants into British waters, we should send the Royal Navy into the Channel and escort them straight back to France. That must be the right if they're going to be bringing them in to us. Margaret wants us to get out of the ECHR, which is inevitably going to be part of, or rearrangement of the ECHR, part of dealing with the small boats. And Marsh just wants Sunak to call Macron and give him what for. So thank you for all of that. Now, it's been a busy few weeks for President Xi Jinping of China. He's brokered a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, hosted talks with Monsieur Macron, and conducted military drills over Taiwan, along with a backtrack threat of a no-fly zone, which we were discussing a moment ago. But it's emerged today that Chinese spies have been sliding into Britain through third countries with visa-free access to the UK. Whether it's intellectual property, energy security or telecommunications infrastructure, to name a few, the threat of China to our national security has been multi-pronged for some time, and it's only getting worse. But this latest revelation has shown fractures within the government as to how the threat should be handled. And I'm very pleased to be joined this evening by the Executive Director of the Interparliamentary Organisation on China, Luke de Pulford. Luke, thank you so much for coming in. How worried should we be about China as a threat to us? It's obviously a threat to Taiwan. We may come to that later. But as a threat to the UK, what is it trying to do?
I would say the important thing to emphasise is that rather than it feeling like a foreign policy issue, with China very far away doing things in Taiwan that might be a little bit threatening, it really is a domestic policy issue. In so many areas of domestic life, China is very heavily involved, from the phones that we use to the energy that we consume. So many different areas of our life involve China and depend upon China. We have pretty heavy and increasing dependency on China in many critical areas. What this means is that we're exposed to the leverage of Beijing, should they not like what we do. We've seen them use what people call economic coercion against Australia, when Australia said, we need to investigate the origins of COVID. Well, China didn't like that, so they decided that they would impose upon Australia huge tariffs on the import of wine, Australian wine. They did the same with Lithuania, and they did the same with Taiwanese pineapples. They could easily do that kind of thing to the UK if we become more dependent on them. So just on a domestic policy criterion, we are very exposed to the threat of China.
But they could do that to goods that we send to them, regardless. What can they actually do if they are embedded in our infrastructure? Are you really saying that they might listen in on our conversations on our telephones, or they might switch off our nuclear power stations or something of that kind?
Well, there's certainly a risk of that. And we have to be a bit careful when we're talking about this, because it easily lends itself to the sorts of reds under the bed type fear, which is not helpful or useful and can lead to racism and prejudice, and we don't want that. What we do want is to be realistic about the threat which is posed. It was very clear from Huawei's infrastructure and technology that it was perfectly possible for that technology to be used for nefarious means.
OK, but just because something can be used for nefarious means doesn't mean that it will be. Is there any evidence that it has been, or there is a plan to use it for these nefarious purposes?
Yes, there is. In fact, quite interestingly, in some economies which are emerging, particularly where the Belt and Road investment scheme is very heavily present in some countries of Africa and in the Middle East, there have been investments in, for example, the parliamentary building, I think in Zambia, if I'm remembering correctly. There was some interesting research about this building, which was between 12 midnight and 4 a.m. There was a huge spike in electricity usage, and they worked out that all of the data from the Parliament building in Zambia was being sucked back into Beijing for analysis. This is not conspiracy, and it's not conjecture, it's fact.
But what use was that information to them? Could it be used for spying, or was it just like Google collects huge amounts of information from us, sucks it back and processes it in California or wherever it processes it, so it can give us a better Google service the next morning?
Well, I think that you're putting your finger on the important question, which is that data collection per se isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is what the intention of the data harvester would be. In the case of China, it's very clear that their increased understanding of the behaviour of people in other countries gives them a strategic advantage in certain areas. This could be the case, for example, with genomic data harvesting, which has been a problem recently with the PRC. So Beijing wants to collect data on genomics, and it wants to do it on a grand scale. Well, longer term, that's going to give them a profound strategic advantage. They will be able to map the genomes of nations and understand what their susceptibilities are to certain illnesses. So if they wanted to develop drugs and develop a monopoly upon those drugs, they could do. Now, all of this sounds conspiratorial when you talk about it, But when you frame it in the context of what Xi Jinping has actually said, which is that China wishes to develop dependency of other nations upon it for killer industries, his words, not mine, then you understand it is a real strategic risk.
But is there a chance that China is in fact benign and that just wants to earn its living through doing this, and it wants to get its economy back to being the biggest in the world, which it was up until whatever it was, the 17th or 18th century, and that it's about rebuilding China and a prosperous China, not really about being a threat to the West and to our values?
Well, I think that analysis belies the last few years and certainly beyond of China's behaviour. The evidence is pretty clear. China would like to see the international order remade in its own image. It wants to see democracy with Chinese characteristics writ large across the world. And domestically, the Chinese government is infamous for its abuses. So you think about Tibet and the Uyghurs and the treatment of the Catholic Church, that it is not a country that accepts Western values for how it should operate or treat its own people. Yes, religious freedom is not respected in China. We still have a situation in Xinjiang where there are millions of Uyghurs who are living under a system of abject repression. But it isn't just them, it is Tibetans, it is Christians throughout China as well. In fact, it's anybody who expresses dissent. If you really want to understand the characteristics of the Chinese Communist Party, look at the way it treats dissidents, which is with zero tolerance and with extraordinary harshness. But that just doesn't extend to people within China. It extends to anybody in the world who they don't like. It extends even to parliamentarian friends of both of ours, who've been sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party along with their families, and who under Chinese law could be at risk of extradition to China. That's how preposterous this thing becomes. Well, I hope that His Majesty's government will not extradite British politicians who are deemed to be not flavour of the month in communist China. Luke, thanks so much for coming on. I think this is a discussion we're going to come back to because China is becoming more and more powerful. It's becoming richer and richer, and our relationship with it over the coming decades is going to be of fundamental importance. Thank you very much. Still ahead, the pugnacious panel are back for the posh version of Coronation Street. Why is everyone so mean to the Duchess of Sussex? And have you worked out who it was who tried to arrest Robert Mugabe? Because he's coming up later.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. There are none from my children this evening. Derek says, I worked there and experienced the bullying of mainland China. Time to declare our support for Taiwan. And Gordon says, we stop buying products containing made in China. And John, America will not allow China to take Taiwan, nor should they. Well, today emerged the moment many of us had been waiting for with bated breath. The question of whether their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, would be attending the coronation of His Majesty King Charles III. And the results are in, ladies and gentlemen. His Royal Highness, the Duke, will be attending, but Her Royal Highness, the Duchess, won't be. And I expect the Duchess will get a lot of undue stick for all sorts of reasons, but I believe this is ultimately cheap. It's the Duke who must take responsibility. He's the member of the royal family. He's the one who was born into the family that has reigned over us now for generations. And anything that is a problem with that must be his responsibility rather than the Duchess's. That she was a successful American actress. She married into this very distinguished family. She found that it wasn't quite what she expected. Her husband has written a misery memoir that has said how awful it is being a member of the royal family and having lots of money and cars and outriders and all these terrible things that must be such a burden for him. She's had to put up with all that. She's provided for the royal family two further members, a prince and a princess, in the line of succession. She's done her duty, effectively, and it's His Royal Highness who seems to be the one who modelled himself on moan a lot, which is not necessarily to be encouraged. But I'm going to throw this over to my panel, because back with me is the former editor of The Sun, and The Sun always has a view on royal stories, always did, Mr Kelvin Mackenzie and the illustrious Jerry Hayes. Go on, Kelvin, you have a go on this subject.
I think it's a wise decision. I think there's a real sense of angst against both of them, and they've solved it. He has to turn up. He has to turn up to his dad's coronation. I mean, really, had he done that, it would have been wholly unacceptable and would have created, I think, even bigger problems than there are. Look, every family has a problem. Every family has a problem. And the problems always exist when a marriage takes place. So somebody that you quite liked, your own son, marries somebody who has their own views and you disapprove of them. And when it's done in a public way like this, that is too much for the nation to bear. They've got enough of their own problems. They think that this lady is causing unnecessary trouble for somebody that they quite liked in the first place. And so this is the perfect solution.
Well, he has to come because he has to swear to be the liege man of the king. That's the whole point of a coronation. It's the whole point of a coronation.
It's his dad.
It's the king.
Yes, I know, but it's his dad. That's the most important thing.
No, it's the king that's most important.
No, it's not. It's his dad. Look, he's a troubled young man. He really is.
Yeah,
and whether Meghan comes, I really don't care. I know I should care. I like the king. I used to know him quite well when I was an MP. You've met him many times.
What's that name I've just seen dropped on the floor?
Yes, and that little suitcase has got a trumpet in it. Yes. Yeah,
there is a change, though. You make that point about liege, etc. The truth about the matter is times have moved. I agree. 100 years ago, if he hadn't turned up, there would have been, or 200 years ago, a serious issue. Right? Today, I buy Jerry's argument, which is there is the dad aspect to it. In a family, you have to show you have to show support. I urge everybody, if they want to see a modern-day version of what's going on in the royal family, to read Vanity Fair and what's going on in the Murdochs right now. It is 10 times better than Succession. Every family has this problem. Unfortunately for Meghan, she was brought up under one kind of world. She's really had to fight from where she came from. And actually, she suddenly discovers the royal family, there are a set of rules which are most uncomfortable for most ordinary people. No. And she starts rebelling against it. And our nation is not used to somebody saying, I don't like this. Making your point that you made there in the monologue, that they have cars and they have wealth and they have fame and they should just shut up. She's not prepared to shut up.
I think she gets a lot of stick unfairly because... Yes. As you rightly say, she wasn't born into this. She didn't grow up with this. She didn't know the rules before she married. And
Neither did Kate. Neither did Kate. And look at the difference.
Indeed. True. But then Prince William's going to be king. And in a monarchy, what matters is the line of succession. Everything beyond that becomes secondary. That spare was the right title. Yeah. And the problem with the spare is that with every new birth you go further down the list and you become...
look at Andrew. A perfect example.
I'd rather not. What a waste of space.
Also, look at the Duke of Kent and Duke of Gloucester, who week in, week out dutifully go around doing things that don't sound always particularly exciting. Both of them now well beyond retirement age, but carry on with an incredible sense of duty.
Princess Anne,
Princess
the
Anne,
hardest working member of... It's fantastic.
So tell me this, if you had to bet, if we were having this discussion in 5 years' time, how many times would Meghan have been back in this country? If she won't turn up for the coronation, I don't blame her, to be honest, because there would be boos and the cameras would be on her all the time and every movement of her face would be being analysed by everybody, right? Do you believe that this is actually possibly the last time that Meghan will come to the UK?
I agree, but I think what hurts her most, she's an American. She probably worships South Park. She has been parodied on South Park. And to her, that is a terrible stab to the heart.
I wish I knew what South Park was. If I knew, I might be sympathetic.
It's an animation.
A cartoon.
And it's an amusing
like
animation.
Tom and Jerry, that sort of thing. Not right, OK, I quite like Tom and Jerry. But I think that's a fair point. She may decide not to come back. But what you're saying is really interesting. You're saying, actually, she's done a favour to the king by not coming back, because actually that would have been a terrible distraction if all people had done was looked at every time she blew her nose.
How she held Harry's hand when they were there, and where were they seated, and where this will all happen anyway. 10 times. Where is Kate? Where is Meghan? What are they wearing? The whole thing would have been, and Charles himself would be a completely side story to this event. So it's a very, very good thing.
It's going to be a bit like that with Harry. But is Stormy Daniels coming? That's what we all want to know. That's what Sun readers want to know.
Can you not touch Kelvin? Oh, you might be start saying that's an assault. We'll have terrible problems. You can't repeat that from last time. I don't think we'll be having any storms over the coronation.
Oh, good.
It rained at the last coronation, and that was quite enough storms for a coronation. But I'm really interested by the idea that actually this is good news for the royal family. It's a good solution. It'll be interesting to see whether he does, with Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, does do formal homage to the king. I think the picture of that would be a wonderful symbolic picture, and is what the coronation in truth is about.
Yes, but the public didn't see it like that. Look, if you're registered as son, you run it as a dad. This is dad and son. There's been a reconciliation. The Liege stuff is wonderful history and wonderful pageantry, and I love it. It's a dad and son story.
All dads and sons want to have a coming together, even although there may have been difficulties. And I'm sure that when Charles is saying, you know, I still love my son and everything, Harry has probably got other issues that are coming up. Somebody said to me, just before it came on air, that in fact he's due back in court in his battle with
the Mail on Sunday,
the Mail, a couple of days later, so it could be all kind of dovetail, but I don't know if that's kosher.
Well, that's another more complicated issue, because I think that if you are in public life, your right to privacy is something that you've abdicated. I think the idea that you can have all the advantages of being in public life and then say, well, I don't like this being in the papers, is absurd. And Parliament never legislated for it. It's all judge-made law through the Human Rights Act.
Well, the truth about the matter is that privacy turns out to be a very strong suit among the young as well. It's a complete change. In my time, it was literally open season. The more famous you were, the bigger the story. And it's true. It's true. So you get done for speeding. What? Did you see that?
I got done for speeding.
Sting
and it was
is
in your paper. It was the next day.
Well, it must have been a mistake because we were only carrying stories about famous people.
Oh, shut up, Kelvin.
But nevertheless, so the privacy thing is massively strong. So you end up with bizarre cases where a woman, a Premiership footballer, married and etc., right, misleads some lady into believing that he's single, that they sleep together, all the rest of it, right? So a paper like The Sun has that story. The Premiership footballer goes to court and gets that story banned on the basis that he has 2 children and that they would suffer in the playground because of this story. So this woman who feels totally destroyed by she thought it was love's young dream, right, has no chance of getting her story out because and he uses the children in that way. It's a fantastic thing, and this is a side effect of the old judges wanting to be enormously liberal about people's private lives.
Well, that's another discussion, but thank you to my brilliant panel. We thought of talking about President Biden, who's been speaking in Ireland, but I'm afraid his speech was so dull that we thought we couldn't have anything to talk about. But up next, after these messages from our sponsors, a man who tried to arrest Robert Mugabe and has been critical of almost everyone you can think of, including the Catholic Church, is now supporting the Scottish Nationalists against His Majesty's government.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope?
It's very much so.
And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Joe says, I hope Prince Harry remains in the UK for good. And he says, P.S. please run for Prime Minister. No, the job's taken. Bev says, Meghan is a disaster. I never thought this would end well. She just wants to be number one. Mrs Simpson was more regal than Meghan. Hark the Herald Angels sing, Mrs Simpson pinched our king. The Scottish Government announced today that it would be following through with Sultana Sturgeon's pledge to take the British government to court over the blocking of the controversial Gender Recognition Bill. The bill sought to enable trans-identifying individuals legally to change their gender without a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, amongst other changes which would have made self-identification easier. But when a female identifying biologically male rapist found himself in a woman's prison, Mrs Sturgeon's downfall followed swiftly after. This is the first time since the Devolution Act passed that the government has blocked Scottish legislation, and it just happened to land on perhaps the most contentious of all issues. Well, I cannot tell you how pleased I am to have my next guest with me. Peter Tatchell is not a man I always agree with by any means, but he has been the most assiduous and courageous campaigner for freedom of speech this country, I think, has ever known. So though we may disagree, it's a real honour, Peter, to have you come in. I think the government's right to use Section 35. I think the risks from the Gender Recognition Bill are considerable and haven't properly been taken into account. And this isn't hostile to people who have gender dysphoria or who have had an operation, but it is to protect women in women's prisons and in other circumstances. And that logic seems to me to be very compelling.
Well, I can understand people having concerns, but I would point to the fact that there are now 30 countries, regions or states around the world that have trans self-ID, including neighbours like Belgium and Ireland and further across the globe, New Zealand. And none of these countries have had any of the predicted problems. So I think the evidence shows that there's no reason for people to have legitimate concerns because there's no evidence to show that things would go badly wrong.
But isn't it evidence that almost as soon as the bill was passed through the Scottish Parliament, a rapist identifying as a woman was trying to get into a woman's prison who was in fact a man, and that showed the problem, that when you've got a rapist using a loophole effectively to get into a softer prison, that shows that is a fact that abuse can take place.
Well, that was an exception. It was a mistake. In fact, that person was never put in the general women's population.
Indeed.
They were in a segregated unit. But it was a mistake. But just because of 1 or even 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 mistakes, that's no reason to generalise and discriminate in law against the whole community. We would never do that about black people or Jewish or Muslim people. I don't see why we should do it about trans people.
I understand that, but under the Act, it wouldn't be a mistake, it would be a right, and therefore that rapist would have had the right to be in a woman's prison because, for all intents and purposes, he would have been deemed to be a woman just because he'd said he wanted to be. And surely that's a risk not just for prisons, but for women's changing rooms and for women-only spaces that women feel they need.
Well, there are clauses in that bill that make it a serious criminal offence for a person to fraudulently claim to be trans, and they could potentially be jailed for up to 2 years if they make a false declaration. And secondly, there are derogations where in certain circumstances, such as a male rapist or a person who identified as male but is now trans, they could be denied the right to be in a woman's prison.
But I worry about the suggestion of a fraudulent claim, because that's essentially a thought crime, isn't it? That you're trying to prove, if it's purely on what you decide as self-identification, then the court would have to prove that you thought something which you were then lying about. And thought crimes are something that are very unsatisfactory as a general point of jurisprudence.
Well, absolutely. But I think, I'm a man, I identify as a man, no one requires me to prove it. I go into a men's toilet, no one stops me and asks for proof of my male identity and my male biology. I just don't like the way in which trans people are being singled out for this particular penalisation.
But therefore the self-identification fraud is not a protection, because you can't really question what people are saying in terms of their motivation, because they can simply say to you, no, that is how I identify. So it's not the protection that it may seem to be.
Well, for example, if a person claimed to be a trans woman and then it was proven that they ordinarily dressed and acted as a male, that would suggest that they had been dishonest, because under the legislation they're required to live in their affirmed gender for at least 6 months.
But once you've got into a woman's prison and you've got the better conditions of a woman's prison, then that's easy. And to prove otherwise would be extraordinarily difficult.
Well, there are a very small number of trans women in women's prisons. None of them, as far as I'm aware, have committed any crimes in prison. They've in no way threatened or made women feel uncomfortable. They've been model prisoners. I think, again, it's a hue and cry over a lot of theoretical possibilities.
That's quite a generalisation, that none of them have made women prisoners feel uncomfortable. I think that's quite hard to evidence.
Well, maybe, but they haven't committed crimes against women, which is obviously a fear, and I understand that fear, but it's not supported by the facts and evidence.
To what extent is this a balance, that you've got different rights that you're trying to protect, and that this is the hardest bit of rights altogether, that you have women who feel at risk and you've got trans people who need protecting, and how do you get that balance right? Is that really where we are?
Well, I think every case has to be assessed individually. So if a trans woman, when they identified as male, committed a crime, or even as a trans woman committed a crime against other women, then clearly they should never be put in a women's prison with the general women's population.
I asked too long a question. Thank you so much, because I'm going to have to move on, but thank you to Peter. That's all from us. Up next, it's the brilliant Dan Wootton. Mr. Wootton, what is in your box of tricks this evening?
Oh, Jacob, well, I've been enjoying your debate earlier. I never thought I'd see Rees-Mogg, the defender of Meghan Markle. I'm sort of on the fence, but we're going to be continuing this discussion with Paul Burrell, he was Princess Diana's rock, and David Starkey, to put it all into a historical context.
You've pinched David Starkey. He's normally on my programme.
For one day
you mustn't
only.
take all my best guests. That's cheating. But it'll be well worth listening to. That's all from me. Coming up is the weather, which is pretty miserable. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. Back tomorrow at 8 o'clock.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. It is gradually going to turn calmer over the course of the next few days into the weekend, but still some strong winds and heavy rain there over the next 24 hours as Storm Noa slowly eases and moves away. Another system moves across southern areas on Friday, but then into the weekend we should see a ridge of high pressure starting to build, allowing it to get warmer and less windy too. So out there, it is a windy evening to come. Outbreaks of showery rain, heavy at times, some snow over the high ground across northern England and Scotland too. Showers easing overnight, some clearer spells developing. Staying quite blustery though, allowing temperatures to hold up above freezing, but still on the chilly side, 2 or 3 degrees to start Thursday morning. And a mixed start, cloudy across the northern half of the UK, showery outbreaks of rain, some sunshine in the south, but as we move through the day, it'll be a case of April showers, sunny spells, and some of the showers will be heavy at times, some hail and thunder. Staying blustery, but the wind's not as strong compared to recent days, but a cold feeling day, only highs